Hello everyone, here I come with you with another video. This time it's going to be another ebook sort of thing, just reading off my paper. This was paper, this was paper done for a intro to philosophy course, but I mean there's some insight that I acquired, I think. Let's see if you can take away anything. And we were assigned to learn about the perspective of this person. This is recording, good. Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher. I think he lived in the 1700s or 1800s, one of them. I don't know which. But we're gonna be, now of course for somebody who's an expert on his work, this is gonna seem very rudimentary, and it is very rudimentary. But this is what could be gotten from an intro philosophy course, so like we didn't read his actual work. It was like a textbook referring to his work and basically describing it. Based on that, we came across the conception of deontology, a framework of deontology, on basically how law and intention should be placed. Alright, so here I go. I open up the document. So, it was done earlier this year. Yeah. So, I mean, of course, I gotta follow the assignment that in the way that they expect me to, the rubric in particular. So, in some ways, there are divisions in the paper, but I want to just go through them before proceeding. So the first part is about lying. Kant said lying is in every single situation wrong. One must never lie. He took that principled position and then the author of the philosophy textbook, Michael Sandel, he brings up a possible understanding of Kant's staunch opposition to lying, in which he says perhaps a person could say just enough so that they still retain their secret, right? If everything you're uttering is true, then you're not a liar. But then I show how it won't always work. It won't work at best temporarily. And then next we go into what does it mean for man to have dignity? What distinguishes humans from animals, and also the difference between treating an activity as means to an end or an end in itself. Specifically, let's say studying as an activity. Is it means for an end or is it an end in itself? And then lastly, that will be about Kant's critique of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. Alright, we good? So, here I go. So just follow along with me or just listen to it carefully. Kant's position on lying. The gist of Immanuel Kant's position on lying was that it's never acceptable, even considering a circumstance where someone may be harmed, because essentially that one must commit the deeds as an end in itself, as if removed from possible consequences, because he would relegate subsequent events to subordinate consideration as the deed is an end sought in itself. Thus one must tell the truth, because that is the morally correct thing to do, as opposed to lying, and the consequences that follow are not of significant, Kant makes the case. His disregard for consequences is what renders his style of ethics as the strict deontological approach, as opposed to the consequentialist/utilitarian approach, to whom that is all that matters. Many find Kant's position unreasonable, but Michael Sandel offers a solution as a response to the lack of adequate reply to the critics of this approach. If one found himself in the circumstance where he may have had to lie in order to save someone's life, lying, even in this instance, would have been unacceptable. Kant would argue as the motive of duty requires one to act, not for the sake of some end, no matter how dire, but in and for the deed itself. Thus lying is never permissible. But Sandel adds, instead of stating the blunt truth and putting one's life at risk, one should rather intend to mislead, that is, revealing just enough to satisfy the demand for an answer, but short of giving away whatever information never have been secured. Not sure if this advice is practical for every possible circumstance, but Sandel provides an example where a murderer comes seeking someone hiding in one's home, and all you would tell him is that you had seen the person earlier in the day elsewhere, which is though itself true, but omitting the part about that person also being currently present in the home. Thus omission does not count as lying, as long as everything one does tell is true. Honest choice case exemplified. Let me just take a sip of water here. This is my shot at novel writing. Consider a man, let's call him Jacob, and let's say he has a partner named Caroline and a 10-year-old son named Cody. Let us describe Jacob's situation as being increasingly more distressing for him. Let us make it so that he was living in a time of general economic recession, and his regular income having become uncertain. Let us also describe his relationship as being one that is deteriorating, and hence commitment also becoming increasingly more difficult, especially considering that he has got to know Caroline better as a person over the years and now finding things contrary to his initial impressions. But Jacob did sure love his son. They had such a strong connection, and Cody was increasingly developing an affinity more towards his father than his mother. But let us say that in the recent several months, depression was getting the better of Jacob, and existential doubts and wonders were becoming increasingly more prevalent in his thought. His days had become somewhat insipid or predictable. His futures had become dim. His relationship seemed terminal, and so this all induced in him more deeper questions of why he was even alive, stuck with a tedious job, a nagging partner, but a son whom he had for unwavering love. He started to seek answers. What was really the purpose in life? The sheer fact of it seemed like to him more so as being a curse than a blessing, as it was a daily grind for the little reward, if it could so be called. How was he deserving of this? Had it been a result of his choice? And he realizes, no, it was not. He never had a choice in being born, as he was as everyone the mere product, or collateral, of pleasure sought in copulation, and thereby he was conceived. Yet in being born to a certain family, society, race, or humanity in general, he was never consulted. He was a mere luck or accident, but as a result, he was summoned to the torment of life in which he now finds himself. Jacob sought and sought, but discovered a dearth of satisfying answers, but merely platitudes and trite statements, bromides. Jacob then found himself descending into a whirlpool of negative, cynical, and pessimistic thoughts, sometimes even to the extent of solipsistic and misanthropic thoughts. He was then submerged in quite somber and darker kind of ruminations. So one day Caroline went downstairs to the basement to satisfy some task, but only to find the shocking sight of a corpse hanging down from a noose. She was at a loss for words. It came to her as a total surprise, and she did not know how to react to this discovery. Tears came down her cheeks, and it all only now started to click. The character, the personality, and the effort exerted by Jacob came to a recognition and appreciation only after his departure. Morning had gone by, no father. Afternoon had gone by, no father. Dusk started to set in, yet still no sign of father. Only silence and a somber mother. Cody finally asks, "Mom, where's Daddy?" How should Caroline answer? Sandel's advice of offering a misleading statement is here no valid. Response of, "He has gone to work," can only go so far. How does Caroline exactly go about telling young Cody about what had happened? How would such a news impact the boy? Certainly no easy answer. Alright, next section. Humanity reflection. In order to get a grasp on why persons are deserving of dignity and respect, it is probably best to start by considering what in particular distinguishes persons from non-persons, or humans from animals, in the Kantian perspective. It begins in the premise that we humans are rational beings, meaning that we possess the capacity for reason. That is to say that we can act autonomously, that is to act so contrarily to external pressures, as opposed to acting heteronomously, that is acting on end or desire that we happen to have or nurture to have. Thus, if someone has a preference for a certain flavor of ice cream, this is simply a preference that one happens to have by nature and not one they necessarily chose to have. Or say that someone is a member of a certain religion. For the majority of religionists, it is merely an affiliation they happen to have by nurture that one they really chose to have. But this is not necessarily so the case for everyone, meaning that individuals can learn to like certain things, or decide to adopt certain values. A person who really does not like seafood, by constant exposure may eventually grow the taste for it. Or a person may start to question the beliefs and convictions that they hold by the virtue of their parents, and decide that they do not always concur with their own conscience or reason, then decide instead to apostatize. Hence these two individuals had defied the patterns that they had found themselves set in, and decided to wander into personally uncharted territories. How so? One factor could be their reason. Thus one can commit to a deed based on the convictions one happens to have, as opposed to having actually chose to have. This latter potential in a person is what distinguishes animals from humans, according to Kant, because no cheetah, zebra, or camel can choose to have a preference contrary to what they as an animal were programmed to have by nature. Let's say a tiger wanting to eat, grass or something. Those humans are rational beings. They have the capacity for reason, meaning that they can have preferences or values contrary to their fellow humans, or even to their own nature. Just a minute. Roommates. Alright, I thought I disrupted them. Okay, we proceed. Thus reason commands persons, but here again we must make a distinction to align consistently with the difference between autonomous and heteronymous acts. One may act to satisfy a desire or an end, in which one utilizes the reason only instrumentally, that is, using it to circumvent various obstacles and hurdles to come to be in a certain spot. Hence, the activity to which one commits to is merely a means to an end, doing X to get Y. Here, reason commands a hypothetical imperative. A good example is when one commits to studying merely to one day get a good paying job. Hence, just a minute. Alright, we proceed. A good example is when one commits to studying merely to one day get a good paying job, and studying for this person is merely a means to an end, and not an end in itself. The deed of studying has only instrumental and not an intrinsic value for the student. Thus reason commands a hypothetical imperative. A student that perceives studying as having an intrinsic value, and for whom studying is an end in itself, reason commands a categorical imperative. And if studying and learning can be regarded in a higher sense as a virtue, hence in this case the person is committing to a virtuous deed for the sake of the deed itself. If a morally good person can said to be one that commits to virtuous deeds, the studying is now elevated to be regarded as a morally encouraged deed, and hence one properly commits to it by considering it as one's moral duty. In this perspective, then, one's pursuing of studies as a means to an end is somewhat a degradation of the virtue of studying itself. Hence this person studies because they perceive it being not as their moral duty, but rather approach it as being merely an obstacle to acquire some other desire or end. Thus their motive is not one of moral duty, but one of inclination towards that end. For Kant, one's seemingly courageous or good-willing act can only be so if they had been encouraged in the right way, that is, if they had their attention directed to the intrinsic value of the deed itself, and regardless for the potential consequences in either of the cases where their act succeeds or fails in its objective. In other words, they had carried out their effort as motivated by their moral duty, hence their reason is understood to have commanded a categorical imperative. That is, they were able to commit such a deed because they were able to recognize its intrinsic moral value, and without ever considering potential consequences of trivial or subordinate things, like rewards or status. Thus their act was due neither to a natural impulse or what had seemed appealing as exhorted by others, but merely by pure practical reasons, i.e., inferences drawn from a priori ratiocinations. This is individual autonomy in the truest sense, and this is what distinguishes humans from animals. But no, this does not imply that every individual acts in accordance with how their reason commands in this way that is at least at times contrary to person's own temptations or insistence by peers, but simply that humans indeed do have that capacity, that they can indeed think and pursue and act contrarily to both they as a corporeal being and as a member of society. Alright, check out the examples I give. It is merely this capacity to redirect the course and pattern of one's life that humans are distinguished from animals. But this is only the basis, or the threshold, because surely some compared to most will commit to actually utilizing this capacity more consistently than others, as they will seek to be independent from both their bodily passions, but also from the impositions of custom and tradition upon them as an individual. Thus, if Kant makes the point that humans are rational beings because they hold the capacity for reasoning and are due their dignity, then surely those who do not only hold the capacity but actually intend to consistently utilize it deserve greater dignity. This then draws a distinction between people merely possessing the capacity and hence being at the threshold to deserve respect, than those who try to employ that capacity to its greater potential and thereby deserving greater dignity and respect. Alright, next section, I think last section here. Critique of utilitarianism. Now we have got a sense in how good deeds could have intrinsic moral value. We could now perhaps start to get a sense of the problems in the doctrine of utilitarianism as viewed from a Kantian perspective. Subordinating the significance of deeds as merely a means to an end is one objection. Another is in which the faculty of reason is treated in utilitarianism, particularly in the way that its purpose being merely to find the means or route in which one could satisfy their desires, and not at all about whether those desires are ones worth pursuing. The ramifications of both these distinctive features of utilitarianism will be elaborated below. First, with the subordination of moral deeds to merely a means to an end, sort of depletes the intrinsic value in the deed itself, and thus the deed of studying is only valuable in regards to its objective. One's giving to charity is only valuable in regards to some objective, or rescuing someone from a burning house is only valuable in regards to some objective, etc. And hence in all these cases, The virtue of the deed itself is inferior in regards to the objective pursuit, and whether or not that objective is intended out of goodwill or some rather less noble motivations is of no importance. For something of a broader context then, when considering human rights, utilitarians may only support that they be upheld in the objective of maximizing utility. Human rights is then, or the respect for the dignity of the individual is to be adhered in the pursuit of an objective other than itself, namely utility or happiness. But with this setup then, the characteristic features of a free society, i.e., individuals' inalienable rights, is placed on a rather contingent or precarious foundation, and hence fails to be absolute, particularly because happiness is based on interests, wants, desires, and preferences, which in people is something prone to change and fluctuate. Just because something makes many people happy does not thereby make it right, and this also applies to legislation. Just because a majority of people favor a certain policy, it does not thereby make it just. If, let's say, in a highly religious society, there was a minority of disbelievers, and the majority one day decide that it would be the best to impose discriminatory policies against the minority, perhaps to incentivize their conversion or conformity. They deemed these policies by the power of their majority. Just a minute. I don't know if it's my roommate's disrupted. Just gotta wait. Come on. Oh, whatever. Anyways, we proceed. They deemed these policies by the power of their majority to be the right one, as it would maximize utility. This concession is then trampling on the rights of the members of the minority. In this way, then, utilitarians may really be acting as the apologetics for majoritarianism. This perhaps becomes lucid why, when human rights is protected only in the purpose to attain an external objective, its security fails to be absolute. It is rendered relative, that is, it will only be practiced or protected if found to be the appropriate means to accomplishing some other objective, and at the moment is found otherwise. Let's say some political theorist comes up with a claim that objective can be better delivered under the aegis of an autocrat without a care for individual rights. It will be relinquished in favor of a different scheme or means in pursuing that objective. That is, if the objective remains to be the same. Another objective to utilitarianism is the premise that pain and pleasure are our sovereign masters, as formulated by Jeremy Bentham. Then, apart from the demotion of good deeds or virtues is merely a means to an end, the faculty of reason is also treated likewise. Reason is the scout for the desires. Reason is the slave of the passions. This respect to a reason really degrades or demeans This element, which in some ideologies is even seen as the spark of divinity that is innate in the individual. Reason, then, when viewed from the Platonic perspective, for example, is the worthy monarch, that only in his prudent governance, with the aid of spirit, over the appetites, is when the soul is properly ordered. But when Benthamites suggest that only the directions of pain and pleasure should be heeded, and even elevate and regard them as our sovereign masters, this amounts to nothing more than one succumbing to his appetites, and all one ought to pursue in life becomes hedonistic in nature, as the appetites have taken the rightful throne of reason. Reason, too, then, is being utilized merely as a means to attaining some objective. It is to be used instrumentally, and its guidance commands only hypothetical imperatives, and one's impetus for action is then nothing more than the motive of inclination. Alright, sorry about the many disruptions of silence. It's just that, it's a shared house, and I only have one room, so I can't be disrupting my housemates, including your family, right? So, hopefully you enjoyed hopefully you were able to take away something. If you just follow along on the text, you got it, Just consider some of those thoughts and ideas and see if it offers any insight. Alright, like, share, subscribe.